AP 120, Chapter 2, the topics carbohydrates and lipids. So now we're going to talk about the two of the four kinds of organic compounds that are extremely important for living things. First up are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That is pretty much it. Just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but it can be an awful lot of those atoms. And carbohydrates have a lot of important functions, including providing quick energy for cells, so that cells can get the energy they need to do the things they need to do rapidly. So the most famous carbohydrate that we will talk about a lot this semester is glucose. Glucose, C6H12O6, can be shown as a line, but is often shown as a circular molecule. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. Glucose and carbohydrates in general, again, provide energy for cells. The smallest of the carbohydrates are called monosaccharides, and glucose, therefore, is a monosaccharide. Monosaccharide is known as simple sugars. These monosaccharides are fitting under a general category called monomers. Monomers are small subunits that can be bound to more of its kind to make bigger molecules. So monosaccharides, or simple sugars, are a kind of monomer. There are a variety of monosaccharides. Again, glucose is the most famous of the carbohydrates. There's also galactose, there's fructose, ribose, deoxyribose. So there's a variety of monosaccharides out there. And then there are disaccharides. Disaccharides, di for two, so double sugars. So that means two monomers are covalently bound together. Some examples of these include sucrose here, good old table sugar, or sucrose. It is a glucose monosaccharide covalently bound to a fructose monosaccharide. So glucose and fructose gives us sucrose. And then lactose is another disaccharide you've probably heard of, where we have galactose bound to glucose. And there's other disaccharides out there, but these are probably the two more common ones for living things. We all love our sugar. Now, when you have lots of monomers forming a bigger molecule, that's often referred to as a macromolecule because it's got thousands of atoms in that one molecule. For carbohydrates, their macromolecules are known as polysaccharides. Poly for many, many sugars, so polysaccharides. And all of the polysaccharides that living things produce are glucose molecules joined together. So these are all composed of glucose molecules, glucose monomers covalently bound to each other. So for instance, we have starch. Starch is the type of polysaccharide found in plants, stored in plants. It's just a long chain of glucose molecules. Then we have glycogen. Glycogen is the way to store glucose in animals. So again, it is a long chain of glucose molecules, but it also has some side branches. So glycogen is how humans, we are animals, humans can store large amounts of glucose in the form of this macromolecule. And then we have lipids. Lipids are another kind of organic compound, another macromolecule, very important to living things. And lipids are organic substances that are insoluble in water. So lipids are insoluble in water. They do not dissolve in water. They are hydrophobic, hydro-water, phobic, fearing water. A more common term for lipids is fats and oils. Fats and oils are lipids. Now, lipids are a kind of macromolecule that does not have monomers. So lipids lack monomers, which is fine. One of the more common forms of lipids found in animals and plants are triglycerides. Triglycerides, tri for three. So triglycerides have one glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. So here is the one glycerol molecule, which is 3 carbons long, each carbon bound to an oxygen. And then 3 fatty acids. The fatty acids are a long chain of carbons bound to hydrogens, except for the very first carbon that's bound to the glycerol has an oxygen, but for the most part, it's just a long chain of carbons and hydrogens. And there are different kinds of fatty acids that are different lengths and sometimes have double bonds in them. So a triglyceride, the most common form of lipids, including things, is made of one glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. Now, some fatty acids are saturated and others are unsaturated. So what does this mean? Well, saturated means that it has the maximum number of hydrogens possible, so that there are no carbon-carbon double bonds everywhere. You see carbon is bound to hydrogens, and only hydrogens and carbons, except of course for the first carbon, that doesn't count. Unsaturated fatty acids possess at least one, maybe more carbon double bonds, which means that there are places where there could have been hydrogen, but there isn't because of that carbon double bond. So here we have fatty acid A, B, and C, which are saturated, which are unsaturated. Well, turns out that A is saturated. Look through this. Every carbon is bound only singly to other carbons and has lots and lots of hydrogens bound to them. This B is also saturated. Again, carbons bound to hydrogens, no double bonds. And then C is unsaturated. Look there, there's a double bond, carbon-carbon double bond, that on top of there being less hydrogens in this fatty acid, it's also slightly structurally bent because of it. All right, functions of triglycerides. Well, triglycerides are important for long-term energy storage. We store energy for the long term in the form of fats, which are in the forms of triglycerides. And then triglycerides are, of course, also an energy source. We can take that energy out of storage and use it. And overall, by weight, the energy stored in lipids is greater, is more concentrated than in carbohydrates. So that's why lipids make a better choice for long-term energy storage. All right, there's another kind of lipids called phospholipids. These are pretty common in living things. They have one, again, they have the one glycerol portion. Then they have 2 fatty acid chains. And instead of a third fatty acid chains, they have a phosphate group. So a phospholipid, phosphate group. Its glycerol is bound to a phosphate group and 2 fatty acid chains. Here it is in cartoon form. Here's the phosphate head and the 2 fatty acid chain tails. Because of this charged phosphate group, phospholipids are what are called amphipathic. This means that the very large macromolecule has a hydrophobic region and a hydrophilic region. The hydrophobic region is, of course, the fatty acid chains, these tails, hydrophobic, and then the hydrophilic region is the phosphate group. Because it is charged, it is attracted to the polar water molecule. Functions. The main function of phospholipids is to form the cell membrane of cells, to form the walls of many organelles, and to form vesicles that can move materials. So phospholipids have a very important structural function. We can't have cells without cell walls, which are made of phospholipids. And when the phospholipids come together to form the cell membrane, as you can see here, the fatty acid chains, they are attracted to each other. Those tails are hydrophobic, attracted to each other. And the phosphate group heads are attracted to the watery solutions on either the inside or outside of the cell. So we get this double lipid membrane. And of course, this membrane also acts to control what can enter and exit a cell. And so this is what is selective permeability, the ability to control the materials crossing the cell membrane to enter or exit the cell. Third kind of lipids is the steroids. Steroids do not have glycerols. Steroids do not have fatty acid chains. Steroids instead are complicated ringed structures. Lots of carbons, lots of hydrogens, and that's pretty much it. The most common, most famous of the steroids is cholesterol. Cholesterol is a steroid, as we can see it here in molecular formula, structural formula. Cholesterol is important structurally. It helps make our cell membranes rigid. We need them to be a certain amount of rigidity. And we produce all the cholesterol we need. We don't need to get any from the foods we eat. Now, other steroids are involved in signaling within the cell. There are a lot of hormones that are steroid hormones. Steroid hormones, therefore, follow this basic pattern, look a lot like cholesterol, except that it has some modification to affect the function, the signaling of those hormones. That is it for this part of the lecture.